Hello and welcome to the SCP podcast. I'm Joanie Connell, your host for today, and our topic is what is being done to protect employees from psychological injury in the workplace and create psychologically safe work environments. So I have a very special podcast for you. We have three experts in the field, and I'm going to introduce each of them very briefly to let them have the opportunity to speak more about what they do and what is actually going on out there. So first, we have Dr. Ashley Spetch. She's joining us from Vancouver, Canada. She's the Chief Mental Health Officer at WorkSafeBC, an occupational health and safety regulator for British Columbia. She works with both employees and organizations on workplace safety. Barbara Zabawa is joining us from Kansas City, Missouri, and she is an attorney for the Center for Health and Wellness Law, and she's also a law professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Kylie van Luyn is joining us from Sydney, Australia. She is a psychotherapist and a human rights consultant, and she spends half her time in Virginia and half in Sydney. So all three of these experts have a lot to explain to you. But first, let's turn it over to them to introduce themselves. So Kylie, why don't you go first?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Kylie. I'm the founder of Elevated Coaching and Consulting Global. I founded my firm about 4 years ago now in Sydney, Australia, and expanded our operations into the US market a little over 2 years ago. So we operate predominantly across Australia and the US, and now we've also started working in Europe and also across Africa. So predominantly we work with leaders, teams and organisations and also government across the US and Australia to build awareness around the importance of fostering workplace psychological safety. We also partner with large nonprofits, particularly in the States where there's no legislation currently to protect workers around psychological abuse in the workplace. And we're currently working with government, senators and policymakers across the United States to have the very first Workplace Psychological Safety Act pass this legislation.
Excellent. All right, Ashley.
So interesting. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So many things I'm going to learn today too. So my career has always been very narrowly focused on workplace mental health. I've done quite a bit of consulting with organizations to help them implement the Canadian National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety and create more healthy workplaces. So now I'm working for WorkSafeBC, still doing similar work, although not consulting, working more internally and on the policy side, also supporting our workers and employers across British Columbia to understand psychological injury and what they can do to prevent it.
All right, Barbara.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here as well. And I bring the legal perspective, I think, to this conversation. I am a lawyer and I specialize in wellness law. And I've written extensively and spoken extensively on workplace wellness and the law in particular. And so for the last 10 years, I have been having a lot of conversations with clients and organizations involved in the workplace wellness industry in the United States specifically. And so what I'm hoping to bring to this conversation is some insight on the legal issues, risks, solutions, or lack thereof in the workplace wellness context, because with psychological safety, certainly workplace wellness efforts overlaps with that, or at least it should in an ideal world. And so that's the perspective I hope to bring to this conversation today.
Well, excellent. Thank you all three for joining us today. And I mean, the first question I have, which I'm sure is burning on everyone's minds right now, is what is being done to protect workers from psychosocial hazards in the workplace? I mean, we've got from all over the world here. So why don't each of you just take a moment to tell us, what kind of laws and regulations there are or on the radar, and from the different vantage points where you stand.
I might kick off. So from where I sit, I guess both US and Australia, There's no current law in the US that protect workers from workplace psychological abuse unless you're a member of a protected class under I think it's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So, and that you can prove that the abuse is due to your protected class membership. So you don't have rights to psychological safety at work under law in the States, and that's why we're working with End Workplace Abuse at the moment around having the Workplace Psychological Safety Act pass this legislation, because it creates an incentive for employers, and it holds employers accountable to prevent and address workplace psychological abuse and uphold psychological safety. In the US, the laws like the Psychological Safety Act or Workplace Psychological Safety Act, it aims to address and mitigate psychosocial hazards, and it's been modelled and written after sexual harassment laws. So what we call the WPSA, the Workplace Psychological Safety Act, establishes that baseline for legal action against toxic work environments without requiring that level of proof of intent or health harm. And it encourages organisations to be more proactive rather than passive in addressing psychological risks such as bullying and harassment and discrimination and burnout. But we know that, proving intent as a victim, and I've been a victim of workplace psychological abuse, it doesn't work with anti-discrimination law in the States, and it won't work with mistreatment in general. Anti-discrimination law used to work when it focused on impact, but then that was shifted in the early 1980s to focus on intent. So it makes it really difficult, and that burden of proof really lies with the victim of the psychological abuse. So I'm sure Barbara can add a whole lot more from her perspective on that.
I'd like to actually have Barbara add some in and then get to Australia afterwards, because I think it'd be really interesting to hear about the US and then look at Canada and Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with Kylie that there is a big gap for protection against psychological trauma in the workplace. Even if you are in a protected class, those cases are hard to bring. I think, as Kylie was suggesting, the U.S. Supreme Court has really undermined the ability to bring disparate impact cases when there are, not direct intentional types of discriminatory actions against an individual who is in a protected class. The Sandoval case really basically said that your only remedy if you are in feeling like you're being discriminated against by the impact of what might otherwise be a neutral type policy in the workplace is complaining to the government. And no discussion about this would be complete without acknowledging that our government is about to undergo a huge change in a couple months, and one that's probably not going to be as friendly to labor as the current administration is. So that is something to keep in mind. There is the Occupational Safety and Health Act General Duty Clause that I've written about as some kind of basis for providing a safe workplace, and that could arguably include psychological safety. To the extent that employees feel unsafe in the workplace, there is the General Duty Clause under the OSHA regulations to try to rectify that. But again, that's, there's not a whole lot of use for the General Duty Clause in that regard. And the administration that's about to take over probably isn't going to be all that anxious to bring cases, but they've surprised me in other situations. I mean, even under the previous Trump administration, the Department of Labor secretary brought cases against companies who were discriminating against tobacco users, for example, with high penalties. And that was surprising to me. I didn't think that would happen under the Trump administration the first time. So you never know. I mean, can't assume anything. But yeah, if you're not part of a protected class, and the OSHA general duty clause isn't something that you could use, you're just, there's not a whole lot of legal remedy. I mean, if to the extent there's any workplace wellness program, there may be resources, there may be ways that you could tie into that to try to say, hey, if you care about us as employees, you should know that your wellness program isn't doing anything good because there's all these other types of factors that aren't being addressed by the wellness program. And that's one of the things that I definitely am trying to do more of in my speaking and writing, is call attention to what I call the social determinants of wellness. So many workplace wellness programs are really just a top-down, cookie cutter, superficial level type of program that isn't really looking at the whole person and the entire environment, including the internal environment, but also the society, social, economic factors that play into an employee's well-being. Psychological trauma is definitely part of an employee's well-being. So if you really are going to be an employer who's serious about improving employee well-being, and that really is a big question, then you would want to know about the factors, the microaggressions, the environment that employees are having to contend with in the workplace, outside the workplace, that is impacting their ability to be productive, their ability to feel well. And all the money you're spending on wellness is probably not doing anything. But if it's just a data collection exercise anyway, then it may not matter. So it really has to come from a place of an employer really cares, authentically cares about their employee well-being. If it's just data collection and trying to save money on premium, it's probably that won't work either.
Well, I know in Canada they're doing a lot more. So actually, can you tell us a little bit about that? Like some of the regulations that actually exist? Yeah.
Sure. Well, we have a ways to go as well. I'm looking forward to hearing Kylie talk a little bit about what's been happening in Australia, because we've certainly had a lot of conversations with them and look to them for setting an example on some aspects. So in Canada, a lot of this is at a provincial level. So speaking to British Columbia specifically, just over 10 years ago, we had changes in policy and new language around protection for workers for bullying and harassment. Around the same time, we also had changes to our workers' compensation system, where workers, if they are injured psychologically at work due to bullying and harassment or other significant stressors, they are entitled to compensation, so wage loss and healthcare benefits for that. That was a pretty significant change. But that's only one of many psychosocial hazards that affect workers. And so we are in the process right now of looking at changes to regulation in British Columbia as it relates to psychological health and safety. And before we get there, we're really trying to spend time with workers and employers to help them understand these concepts. And, Barbara touched a little bit on, is this sort of a tick box exercise as we're thinking about psychological health and safety, or is this something real and something meaningful? And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is spending time with employers to help them understand what the concept is and really what the value is to employers and workers. And I think at the most simple level, it's reducing all of the unnecessary things that get in the way of employees being productive and well at work. And there is so much benefit for both workers and employers in that. And I think a lot of the work that we still need to do is explaining in detail what are those psychosocial hazards that impact different workplaces, different industries, small, medium, large employers. It's also different. And how do workers and employers work together more collaboratively? How is there more worker involvement in identifying what the risks are? What are those things that are getting in the way of them being productive and well? And how do we support workers and employers in putting together a comprehensive plan to mitigate those risks?
Interesting. So it sounds like a little bit, not just the stick, but the carrot too, for the organizations. Like this can actually be good for you
Yeah,
well.
I don't like to be in the business of sticks. Yes, we do have the ability when we have, regulation in place. We do have the ability to have administrative penalties, but that's not our goal, right? We just really want to build awareness and education and motivation because there's so much value in this for workers and for employers.
Mhm. Well, Kylie, let's move into Australia for a moment because I know there's a lot more being done there too. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think Australia's approach has been a little more cohesive. So we've got national work health and safety legislation that's implemented at the state and territory levels. So we have the Model Code of Practice, which ensures a uniform baseline for managing psychosocial hazards, and it offers clear guidance on employer responsibilities. I think in Australia too, we've to use Ashley's terminology, we've combined that carrot and stick approach. So, making sure that this legislation at a state and territory level is, its compliance and its regulations that employers need to meet. It is very stringent. You may have heard, we've recently passed some legislation here around the right to contact employees after business hours, which was quite contentious, even in Australia, which typically we lean much more towards the labour force or the workforce than we do employers at times. But I think that the Work Health Safety Act here in Australia, it includes those provisions that requires employers to manage psychosocial risks as part of their duty of care. So it's not just around physical injuries now. It's very much the focus is moving, probably mostly in the last 18 months to 2 years, really looking at the psychological harm and injuries that are sustained and acquired in workplaces and what that does to a human being. But in 2022, Australia introduced a new model code of practice that's specifically addressing psychosocial hazards, and it requires employers to implement those systemic risk management strategies to protect employees, and they have to report on those. And I think in Australia, compared to the work that we do in the US, there's a lot more opportunities as well for legal recourse here in Australia. Like Barbara was saying, it's really difficult for employees who are victims of psychological abuse in the workplace, not only to prove that they have suffered or sustained that psychological injury in the workplace and that it's because of a particular leader or because there's policies lacking in an organisation. In Australia, there's a lot more opportunities for that legal recourse outside of just suing your employer and having the financial means to do so. And also discrimination laws in Australia, they protect all workers, not just citizens of protected classes. So in Australia, we have, at the federal level, we have the Fair Work Australia, I guess that organisation, that entity, and that also includes the Fair Work Ombudsman, who is a neutral party that typically acts to try and mediate workplace issues. I've been involved in many of those in my time, and it is a really useful entity in trying to mediate between the employer and the employee. And there's also additional protections and legislation in Australia against what we call adverse action. So I think in the States it's referred to mainly as retaliation. So if you're an employee that raises a concern or a grievance, usually when it relates to directly to a leader or somebody in a supervisory position, here in Australia, those people are really protected around adverse action or retaliation for raising that complaint. And there are, like I said, a lot more avenues for legal recourse for those people that may be victims also of that retaliation or that adverse action. And in Australia, we've also got federal legislation that was brought in, I believe, in 2014, that is a really different anti-bullying legislation and act that previously, if you were bullied in the workplace here in Australia, you could take legal action against the organisation or your employer. That changed in 2014 so that you can actually, if you're a victim of bullying in the workplace now, you can not only take legal action against the organisation or your previous employer, you can actually sue the leader or the individual themselves that was responsible for that bullying. So there's some, I think, key things that are some differences between the US and Australia.
Ashley, I know you've also been attending conferences in the European Union. Do you have some indication of what's going on over there that might be similar or different from here in Australia and Canada?
Yeah, I think that they're a little bit ahead of Canada as well in terms of having clarity. But it's different everywhere, right? Every country over there is a little bit different. I know they have all come together. There's a paper actually, I believe, coming out fairly soon on this topic exactly. But Finland has done a lot of great work. So has Sweden. In certain countries, there's specific things in regulation and not others, and that differs across countries. For some, it's around kind of excessively demanding work. For others, it's specific to bullying and harassment. For some, it's workload. Some mention stress. So it is different in different countries, but a lot of work has been done, and a lot of work has been done in terms of setting standards and trying to have some consistency, I think, across countries and learning and education together as well. So there are quite a few publications about what's going on over there, but it is a bit different across each country.
Well, I'd like to ask all of you this, but I want to start with Barbara. What is psychological safety and what is psychological abuse or harm? I mean, maybe sort of legally as well as psychologically. I mean, how do you even describe that, or how would somebody, I don't know if you write about that in your articles, or when somebody would file a complaint, what would be examples?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not aware of any law that defines psychological.
Oh, okay.
Safety. But in my mind, it encompasses a lot of different concepts like discrimination, free from discrimination and harassment, free from retaliation. If we're looking at it in the workplace specifically, free from concepts like bullying and violence, whether free from mental anguish. I mean, you can look at the terms and the conditions of the employment, and are you feeling like you're having excessive amounts of stress or anxiety about your working conditions and deadlines and workload and pressures that are put on you, and are you able to be productive to the point where you feel good about your work, as opposed to you have anxiety about going to work for any number of those reasons. And I will point out, we talked a lot about in the US the discrimination protections like Title VII. Of course, there's all state laws that have a lot of times broader protections than the federal law as far as protected classes. So like in some states, you might be, if you were a convicted felon, you might be protected if you get discriminated against, or if you use lawful products off the work site, those kinds of things might be available to you as protections and under state laws. And then I also wanted to point out the National Labor Relations Act, which isn't always thought of as a statute or federal law that could protect workers, but it can for sure. If it relates to concerted effort by employees who feel like the terms and conditions of the employment is to their detriment, they have complaints and they can work together to try to make changes, then they can be protected. Even if they're not unionized, they can get protection under the National Labor Relations Act if there is some sort of adverse action taken against them. So but it has to be concerted. It can't be just one person working, on their own behalf. It has to be like a group effort. So I will mention that too as another resource in the US that maybe is overlooked sometimes.
Mm-hmm. What about Kylie? I mean, you've seen this in the US too. Do you find ways of being defined, or even in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, and I think it's important when we talk to employers and leaders about psychological safety. Depending on the country, it seems like people's understanding and awareness differs. Although we've got legislation here in Australia, there's still. I was surprised when I've returned from the States after living over there for a little over a year. Returned to Sydney 3 months ago, and was really surprised that we're still focusing on psychological safety in the workplace like it is a new concept here, even though we've got really established legislation. So I think that even though there is legislation, or there may not be yet in some countries, I think that within certain organisations, there's different things that drive leaders and organisations to either really focus on this and nurture psychological safety in the workplace or not, whether that's because it's the right thing to do or because it affects the bottom line. But when we're working and explaining the concept, typically we say that psychological safety in the workplace is the right to feel safe at work, being able to speak up or out when you feel threatened or you disagree with certain things or you feel overwhelmed, and knowing that you won't be punished or threatened or embarrassed doing so. And then psychosocial hazards really refers to a safe environment and organisational systems that are clear and easy to use and supportive, and safe social systems. So when you're thinking about people and relationships. So I usually say that psychosocial risks are the negative factors that can harm employee wellbeing and productivity. And if they're left untreated or not addressed, then they usually end up being psychological safety issues and can tend to cause psychological harm.
Mm-hmm. Ashley, how would you define it?
Yeah, we often talk about psychological health and safety in the workplace. So that's the language that was used in the Canadian National Standard, which was not a regulatory document, but really designed to guide employers and workers across Canada. We talk about a workplace that is, free of harm. We talk about reckless or negligent harm in the workplace. But I agree with your definition. I think there's sometimes some confusion when we talk about psychological safety as you defined it, because when we talk about psychological health and safety in the workplace, it's more than that. I think another thing that can sometimes be a little bit confusing is the perspective when we talk about workplace mental health or wellness and thinking about the individual focus. And I think there's been a lot of discussion and work done around individual resilience and wellness programs and what can we offer to workers to promote their mental health. And we need to do more on what can we do in workplaces, the systems perspective, to prevent people from exposure to those psychosocial hazards, right? To understand what those exposure levels are, how they differ for roles, for different industries, and putting in, a systems perspective in place to really mitigate exposure to those risks for people. So less focus on what can we, the employee and family assistance programs, benefits. A lot of that I think is of great value, but it is not enough, and it isn't the foundation of creating a psychologically healthy and safe workplace.
Right. Well, we've got time for one more question, and I just think that'd be really beneficial to our audience being organizational consultants, coaches, and as well as leaders and people in organizations. And just wondering if you have like a recommendation for them to, I guess in terms of trying to create more psychologically safe work environment or anything that you would have as a final recommendation for our audience. So, Kylie, why don't you start since you're next to me?
Sure. I think it starts with awareness. I spoke at an event a couple of months ago, and this gentleman said to me, "What do you do?" He was in human resources, and he said, "What can I do in my position?" Knowing what I know, which is a lot of the leaders in my organisation are not deliberately harming people, but their leadership styles and their behaviours day to day are actually psychologically abusive.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, what can I do around that? And what's your advice? And I said, well, it begins with awareness, right? And it also, when you're talking about the fact that leaders are often the perpetrators, not always, but they often are, and they are also the leaders of the organisational culture. They're responsible for what a culture of an organisation looks like. It's really important to build awareness not only around what workplace psychological abuse and harm looks like, because some people think that abuse is one particular thing. We've all got our ideas around what abuse looks like, but often leaders don't realise that they are their own lack of self-awareness around their own leadership styles and their behaviour, how that is contributing to the psychological abuse of some of their staff. So I always say it begins with awareness, not only about the self-awareness of leaders, but also very much doing that training when it comes to building awareness around what psychological abuse and harm and what psychologically safe workplaces look like as far as best practice, but also looking at their policies and their procedures and their leadership practices when it comes to things like identifying and addressing things like bullying and mobbing, and being really familiar with those terms and what they actually mean when it comes to human beings and what psychological abuse and harm looks like. So for me, it's building the awareness first, and then and a big part of that is putting all employees through quite rigorous training so that they all understand the concept and that they understand what psychosocial hazards are and the relationship to psychological safety, but also then really working with the leaders, because they're the ones that are going to tolerate that behaviour or not.
Ashley, what about you?
Yeah,
From your psychological perspective.
I completely agree with everything Kylie said. Often one of the things I talk about most is manager mental health training. It's straightforward, clear, easy thing to do and has been demonstrated to make a significant difference. I think another thing I hear come up is, what if there isn't buy-in at the top? What if I'm a leader or someone working in people and culture and I want to make a difference, but there isn't buy-in from the top? And, it is key to have senior leadership buy-in. This is a part of culture, but also every single person makes up the culture of an organization. Be the change you want to see and lead that charge to the best of your ability, right? Don't give up on this because there isn't buy-in at the top. I think part of what managers and leaders and people in culture need to do is to motivate everyone to understand that this really is not just the right thing to do, but it is also about the bottom line. If you want to be productive and successful as an organization, you need your people to do it, and you need your people to be well. And it's been well documented in research that psychosocial hazards get in the way of that. So it's in your best interest to work with your workers to reduce those, so you can all work productively together towards the things that matter.
Excellent. Now, Barbara, why don't you wrap up with a legal perspective here on our recommendations? Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's legal, but based on my work with wellness legal partnerships and looking at workplace well-being and the social determinants of wellness that I mentioned earlier, I think for me, the most influence that an employer can have on worker well-being, psychological safety, is to have a paradigm shift on what their role is regarding workplace well-being and psychological safety. And their role should be about empowerment, empowering employees with the tools and the resources, removing barriers so that they can flourish and be their best selves at work and elsewhere. And so to the extent there are barriers, to the extent that there is a lack of resources, to address those and stop blaming the victim. It's about giving employees the space to grow and empowering them. And so that's the perspective that I hope that my work will start bleeding into the workplace wellness space, because it's been top down, blame the victim, you change your lifestyle emphasis for way too long.
Excellent. Wow. You three could not have said it better. And in terms of all that people can do, us as organizational consultants and people in organizations, and what this looks like, what's being done already, the regulations and around the world as comparison. So thank you all three for joining us. Thank you so much. It's been very, very informative. And I'd also like to encourage our viewers and listeners to look up Kylie, Ashley, and Barbara on LinkedIn. I will put their links up after the podcast so that everyone can see all the work that they are doing and learn more from all of our experts here. So thank you three, and thanks to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you next time.